This is part B of Monday, March 14th lecture because I ran out of space on my computer and the computer cut off my recording. So we still have about, I think I was at 29 minutes. So we'll continue on where we left off, which is the moral rules of part 3. So if you're looking at the notes for today, we went over the first rule, which is obey the laws and rules and religion of your country. Second, resoluteness. Now, I think what he means is you continue your experiments even if you have moral doubts about them, that the pursuit of the truth overrides all other considerations. And if you see a sense of a kind of a Frankenstein-like morality, I think there's something to it. Descartes says you may have reservations about where your pursuit of truth is taking you, but be resolute and continue on no matter what. Almost as if the end of scientific truth will justify the pursuit of any experimental means of truth. Now, I want to come back to the third rule because it seems to me this is the part where Descartes more or less consciously incorporates Machiavellianism. The fourth rule, to continue on the path of the third point, fifth rule, which might be both a combination of resoluteness and the first rule, obey the laws of your country, is to continue on the path of the method, both in terms of pursuing it yourself and disseminating it. So keep going. Now, the third rule is to conquer myself rather than fortune. Let fortune determine my virtue. And rather than now, of course, he's aware that the ancient virtue meant curbing your desires, that an act of virtue meant curbing your desires, given and presuming the impossibility of all objects of your desire. And he says, as if so that I should no more want to be a free man if I were in jail, or to be a healthy man if I were sick, and that we should presume, for instance, that for the preference to be healthy as opposed to being ill, I would wish for bodies as incorruptible as diamonds. But as you're going to see, that's exactly what he promises in part 6 of the method. And so in some ways, I think this third rule is meant ironically. Rather than to conquer yourself rather than fortune, I think what he's offering is to conquer fortune, following Machiavelli's pitting of virtue versus fortune. And again, rhetorically embodied in this third rule. So again, the reason I think that the third rule is ironic in part 3 is because he overturns it or reverses it in part 6, and it turns out that even though nature appears to have unlimited power over us, if we do it right, we can actually reverse the board, so to speak, and exercise mastery over nature, which would give a healthy man not only the desire to be an ill man, not only the desire to be healthy, but to be as healthy as possessing a body as incorruptible as diamonds. So we're to part 4, and which is, as I said, at the beginning of my comments in part A of this lecture, that in addition to the definition of truth, which we've actually seen already in part 2, that which is clear and distinct in our minds, and then the other elements of this part are the undoubtable proposition of one's own subjective existence, the proof of God's existence that derives from that, and the immortality of the soul. So let's look at the undoubtable proposition, because remember, Descartes is saying I have to clear every statement, everything about reality or existence that I learned or inherited, I'm clearing out like trash and starting my foundation on something that is undoubtable. And what does that begin with? His own existence. I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. Can this be doubted? Has Descartes, in fact, lived up to his promise of finding a proposition that is beyond doubtability? First of all, note that this has the abstract formality of an equation, A equals A. If you write it as an equation, I think equals therefore I am, and cancel out and solve for the variable, in some ways you get the perfect clarity and distinctness of a mathematical equation, which is true because each part is clear and distinct. A equals A. That is to say, A is defined in terms of A. And therefore, in some ways, you could say this: what I think, therefore I am really means is I equals I am. So it might not be an accident. I've never thought of this before. That when in Exodus, when Moses asks, "Whom shall I say to the Jewish people sent me?" and God says, "Tell them I am sent you." Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I am what I am. I am that I shall be. I am what I shall be. I am what I am. Like Popeye the sailor. Um, so on one level, let's so it, why is this true? Why is it undoubtable? Um, uh, I think first of all because it possesses that clarity and distinctness of a mathematical proposition. But second, I think he would say this is experientially true. You because you are aware of yourself, you must exist. And and I've taught this material enough to know 1,000 objections as to what if you're all this is a dream? What if it isn't real? And Descartes' ready for you. He says even if this is a dream, you're still dreaming it. So you can't unthink yourself, unlike the joke about the so forth. Um, um, you can wrestle with this yourself, whether or not. So let me just say that where this goes now, you're going to see it goes immediately in the direction of in Descartes' argument of proving God's existence and the immortality of the soul. We'll go over those in a minute. But also, in some ways, you could say this means that Descartes isn't just the founder of modern science, along with Bacon and a couple of other big guys at this time. But you could say there's a pretty straight line from what Descartes is claiming to be the only thing that human beings can be certain of. Uh, Even scientific truth, as I've said earlier, is only propositional or provisional, rather. There's a pretty straight line between this and the culmination of modern thought in existentialism and Nietzsche and the 20th century existentialists, who argue the only thing that you know is that you exist, and no other statement is provable about the universe or the world that we live in. So, in a way, Descartes is both the twin founder of modern subjective existentialism and also the founder of modern science. Now, whether or not this statement is true, and whether or not it's true that you can't know anything about the world other than that you exist in it, yet this is pure subjectivity, and many subsequent philosophers have located the true origins of modern, as I just said, of modern existentialism in Descartes' simple proposition that the only thing you can know is your own existence. We will talk about more about this later on. So let's go to the proof of God's existence and the immortality of the soul. In some ways, Descartes knows. So what do you know? You know you exist, and you know that you're not a perfect being. Because you can imagine a perfect being, therefore there must be a God. That I could be distorting the proof, but if you follow the links of it, it seems to be that. In fact, he compares it to a triangle. Um, um, every triangle, like we're the imperfect real triangle, but there's still an ideal triangle somewhere that consists mathematically and formally as a definition of three angles, each equaling 180 degrees. So, in some ways, um, it, because you exist, which you know, and because you know you're not perfect, because you can imagine a more perfect being, there must be a God who is the source of your idea of perfection, since you are an imperfect being and couldn't be the source of your own idea of perfection, like in the analogy of triangles. So, God must exist because I exist. I'm an imperfect being. I know that I'm an imperfect being, and therefore only a perfect being could be the source of my idea of perfection. Therefore, there must be a God. As for the immortality of the soul, while you can imagine your body without a soul, I should say you can imagine yourself. You can imagine yourself not having a body. Therefore, a soul separate from the body must exist. Now, are you persuaded of these? Descartes maintained to his death these were sincere proofs of God's existence, and the only reliable proof of God's existence, and the only proof of the immortality of the soul. Now, we talked about this in class on Friday. Um, are these persuasive? Why are they here? Now, the formal reason why they're here is Descartes claims that unless you believe in a God who is the source of ideas outside your head, the idea that the ideas in your head could be descriptive of the reality outside your head is the only way that that could be the case. That is to say, the only way, so the formal reason for proving God's existence is that scientific knowledge is impossible unless God exists. That is to say, unless there is the only way that you can know if the idea is in your head, describe a reality outside your head, is if you believe in a God who could make the reality outside your head correspond to the reality inside your head. Um, so that's the formal reason for proving God's existence, because it makes scientific truth possible. Yet, if you go back to our discussion of the method and how I think this culminates in part 6, and the fact that he does say right after this that there's no way to know if our dreams are more real than what we perceive when we're waking. If that's the case, then this would actually comport with the kind of existential nature of truth, that actually you can't be sure of anything you say about the outside world. And in some ways, my suggestion later on in part 6, as I've already mentioned above, is that experiment replaces God's existence in the reality of the unfolding of scientific truth. In other words, um, the only thing that guarantees whether what you think explains the reality outside your head, that is to say, even after you've gotten all the ideas and measured clearly and done experiments, is experiment. So remember, I think Descartes really thinks that scientific truth is provisional, it's not absolute, and this whole notion of proving God's existence is not necessary for the enterprise of science to proceed. What is necessary is that the bridge between internal reality, subjective reality, and external or objective reality is experiment. So then why are they here? And this is something that we already talked about in class. I think you could argue there might be 4 reasons for this. One is Descartes is sincere about these proofs, and that he has to prove God's existence in order to show that truth is possible, that external truth is possible. And in some ways, you could say this shows the compatibility that Descartes says I can be a scientist and a believer at the same time. And since he claimed that he was sincere about these things, you have to weigh them on their own evidence. So one possibility is he believes he really has proved God's existence. Although this God, by the way, is not what you could call the biblical God or the salvational God. It's just a propositional God who exists to show that scientific truth is possible. But you could say again that he's sincere about that, and you have to work through those arguments yourself. And again, you could say it proves. As by the way, there are many believers who are scientists, and many scientists who are believers. And Descartes said, "I'm at the head of them." Now, the other 3 possibilities are ironic possibilities. Remember his own self-imagining of his own situation is somebody tearing down a house and replacing it at the same time. So you have to keep the idea of God and the soul alive until the process of rebuilding the new scientific house of humanity is complete and people can set aside their superstitions like children set aside their belief in Santa Claus. But you have to preserve that belief until they're ready for the real truth. Second, and it's a longer range possibility, and one that we'll come back to time and time again in these thinkers, is that you have to keep the language of faith and morality, or virtue, to use a Machiavellian term, alive in a world that doesn't support them. So there's no support. Remember, Machiavelli says in chapter 15 of The Prince that all ancient virtue was based upon an imaginary reality. And so, yet, we seem to need the concept. Um, uh, and so Descartes may be launching a new kind of scientific humanity, but at the same time, somehow reserves the possibility that without the language of God and the soul, people may become moral monsters, and that somehow even scientists in the future who don't necessarily believe in God per se or the God of the Bible may have to believe in some kind of whole or spiritual entity, and that humanity can't live without the language. Now, by the way, when we come to Nietzsche, we'll see that that's in a way what Nietzsche says. The world is a black abyss of emptiness and supplies no support for our moral judgments or our identities. Yet we just have to whistle in the dark because we need those things. We need morality. So if the universe doesn't provide it, we have to invent it. That's Nietzsche in a sentence. And Descartes. So the third possibility, which is ironic, is that is that we simply need these concepts in a world that doesn't support them. In which case, by the way, human identity is fundamentally alienated from the world around us. But so to keep the human world together, we need these concepts, even if there's no basis for them. The fourth ironic possibility, which we've talked about, is that, and there's some awareness for this, is to protect himself against persecutorial authority, because he lets you know he's aware of Galileo, etc. So let's finish up with the discourse on method by looking at part 5. Now, part 5, again, is physics and anatomy. which I suggest, again, repeating my brilliance, that part 5 comes after part 4, that part 5 is actually a replacement for part 4, and that the study of physics and the material world replaces theology, and the study of the body and the circulation of the blood through the heart, which he anticipated William Harvey, who actually did, in fact, do the dissection necessary to see the circulation of the blood. And that, in some ways, physiology replaces psychology, in the same way that physics replaces uh, theology. So, as you'll see, this unleashes a great philosophic question, which different interpreters of Descartes have different answers to. So matter is a machine, and physics is the study of cause and effect of the matter of that machine, and that explains everything in the physical universe. The body is matter, and therefore all animals are a kind of a chemical machine in motion. Rousseau, by the way, will actually say something like that later on in the second discourse, that all animals are a machine, sort of like a robot of chemistry. So, so what's Descartes saying here? Well, let's look at his own words and then try to figure this out. On the bottom of 31 and the top of 32 towards the end of part 5. After this, I described the rational soul and showed that it can in no way be drawn from the potentiality of matter, as can the other things I've spoken of, but that it ought expressly to be created, and how it is not enough to be lodged in the human body like a pilot in his ship, unless perhaps to move its members. But it must be joined and united more closely to the body, so as to have in addition feelings, appetites similar to our own, and thus to make up a true man. As to the rest, I elaborated here a little bit about the subject of the soul because it is of the greatest importance, for, after the error of those who deny the existence of God, which I believe I have sufficiently refuted in part 4, there is nothing that puts weak minds at a greater distance from the straight road of virtue than imagining that the soul of animals is of the same nature as ours, and that as a consequence we have no more to fear and hope for after this life than have flies or ants. So that while one understands how much they differ, one understands much better the reasons that prove that our soul is of a nature entirely independent of the body, and consequently that it is not subject to die with it. Now, since one cannot see any other causes that might destroy it, one is naturally led to judge from this that the soul is immortal, as we saw it in part 4. So, um, Descartes states, now, is this ironic? I leave it was a question mark because I think this is a difficult matter of interpretation of Descartes. Um, um, that the mind is carried by, but is it caused by the body? Again, he states that it is independent, but then in part 6, he declares that the mind is so dependent on the body that it is in medicine that psychological cures for the diseases of the mind is to be found. Now, Descartes also wrote another work, one of his last major work called The Passions of the Soul, in which he actually traced all the operations of mental consciousness back to some kind of physiological part of the body, and arguing that the physical seat of the soul was in the pineal gland. So, on one level, is Descartes a monist who believes that everything is explainable as the same principle, which would be, of course, material causation? That would mean our soul, ourselves, are simply imaginary overlays of physical causality with no freedom, only that our freedom is an imaginary byproduct of our own consciousness? Or does he really argue that there's a realm of mind and soul which is completely independent? Is he a dualist? That is still a matter of interpretation. But let's finish with the discourse on method with looking at the nature of the scope of the scientific project. The new science, the new world. Now, I've already explained when we first turned to the discourse from the quote that we read at the beginning of part 6, it's the expansion of human power. And I suggested that knowing all, by measuring, defining, and knowing all the motions of nature, we can become, as it were, make ourselves, as he says, masters and possessors of nature, and overcome the effects of the fall. We can then turn the fruits of the earth through scientific conquest into our comfort machine, rather than the uncomfort machine that makes it uncomfortable when it's too hot, too wet when it's flooded, etc. And he says this is especially to be seen in an augmentation of medicine that can cure perhaps even the enfeebleness of old age, which promises that body is incorruptible as diamonds, back in the third moral rule in part 3. So, and we've seen when we saw the role of experiment that what he presumes is the communication and the unification of humanity as the scientific species. Science must become the culture of humanity, gradually replacing the older traditional foundations of culture, morality, politics, and superstitious religion. What will drive this project? Medicine, as Bacon, which we saw in the first quote that we looked at the beginning of the pre-recorded lecture, the previous lecture, a more comfortable and convenient life. Well, what about war? Because you could say that expanding human power also means expanding the possibility of the weapons of war. I think you could say that the Cartesian enterprise is a kind of a gamble, that the knowledge that drives medicine will outstrip the knowledge that drives the development of weapons. Well, 400 years later, we are kind of right in the middle of that one, aren't we? And so, one interesting possibility which Descartes doesn't seem to consider is that the augmentation of human scientific power may lead to, while while you hope that that final world of unified humanity through science will overcome the tensions and struggles between politics and religion, it's not the case yet, as in fact we know from Ukraine. So might it not be that the Cartesian project may end in universal devastation as much as universal liberation from material causality? Well, how will we know when we've achieved this? If Descartes is right that scientific knowledge consists of knowing every natural phenomenon so that you can master it, you could argue that we'll know when the scientific project is over, when there is no natural process inside or outside of us which we cannot explain and therefore manipulate. So let's end with a few questions that we might ask of Descartes 400 years later. What moral principles, if all morality is nothing other than a way of guiding scientific inquiry, what morality will guide the expansion of human power, given that nature no longer supplies any guidance, and that theology that God is imaginary doesn't exist? But nature no longer is a source of guidance as it was for Aristotle and Plato. When you abandon that notion of imaginary, quote unquote, imaginary nature, all nature is like silly putty for human power. And that our own scientific virtue can conquer the material forces of nature. And divinity, since it's been pushed into irrelevance, so in some ways, what will guide the moral use of our power? Our ability to use that power. What motivates the science to pursue knowledge? Beneficence? Power? Fame? Perhaps, although Descartes suggests it's because I just love humanity so much. Generosity, generosité. Um, and last, this is the great question which Machiavelli leaves unanswered at the end of chapter 25 in The Prince. So, are we the puppets or the masters of nature? Um, does virtue control fortune? Because he says, Machiavelli says at the end, fortune controls everything, but you can control fortune. Well, again, is that tricking human beings into believing something that's impossible in a world that doesn't support human freedom? So, does humanity's mastery over nature? Well, by the way, that's the one question. You're going to see there's a political dimension to this too, which we will play out in subsequent authors and thinking. Does humanity's mastery over nature imply naturally the mastery of some humans over others? In other words, if you read Huxley's Brave New World from 1936, a scientific future in which the scientific masters of humanity shape and control to their own happiness, by the way, the fate of every human being like a puppet, then scientific mastery over nature has enabled a complete scientific mastery over humanity for humanity's own comfort, beneficence, and happiness.